Mother Nature, Mother Nature, she's gonna get you. Yeah, she's gonna get you. Mother Nature, she's grown to hate you, and she's gonna get you. Gonna get you, you betcha.
Welcome to Nature Bats Last on the Progressive Radio Network. It's NBL on PRN.FM. This December 2020 edition, episode 145 of Nature Bats Last, comes to you live from Rakino Island in Aotearoa and also from Central Florida in the United States. This is Kevin Hester, and I'm again joined today by my co-host, Professor Guy McPherson. So today's show includes a conversation with Dr. Andrew Glickson, who Guy and I have interviewed twice previously on the show. You can find those episodes in the show archives.
Thank you, Kevin. We are ecstatic to have renowned geologist Dr. Glickson join us today. We will focus on his latest book, The Event Horizon, Homo Prometheus and the Climate Catastrophe, published by Springer. We will take your toll-free calls today. Please call us with your questions and comments after we spend a bit of time with our guest. We are most easily reached with a toll-free telephone call to 888-874-4888. Kevin, will you do the honors?
Dr. Andrew Glickson is a geologist living in Australia. He is an earth scientist and paleoclimatologist, currently serving as visiting fellow at the Australian National University, where he splits his time between the Climate Science Institute and the Planetary Science Institute. He is the author of dozens of articles and 11 books. Dr. Glickson was kind enough to share an advance copy of his latest book with us for this conversation. Welcome back, Dr. Glickson, to Nature Bats Last on the Progressive Radio Network.
Yeah, good day. How are you, Kevin?
Wonderful, sir. Thank you for once again giving us your valuable time. The first thing I'd like to ask about the new book is what motivated you to write this book, and what is the main takeouts that you'd like your readers to learn from
it? Thank you for that. I need to ask you, is this a live recording? Because it's a very weak line and I can just hear you.
Okay, I'll speak up as much as I can. Sorry. Yeah, we're live on the radio now.
It is live.
Yes, indeed it is, sir.
Is this a live recording or is this a pre-recording?
No, it is live. We're on here at the moment, so we'll just have to make do with the audio as best we can.
Can you repeat the question, Kevin?
Okay, what I'd like to know is what motivated Andrew to write this latest book, and what was the main takeouts that you would like your readers to get from it?
Yeah, okay. Well, developments with the climate are extremely fast. As soon as you read or write or learn of the news, within a few days or so, new developments are taking place. And there is an avalanche of reports and of papers. So I'm basically trying to make sense of some of it. My background is in the history of the atmosphere and ocean. My background is in the history of the atmosphere-ocean system. And with this perspective, what is happening now is truly frightening. I wish I could communicate some good news, but what is happening is truly frightening.
Guy, would you like to
Are
ask
you
the next
there?
question? Yes.
You're
Okay, well, I'll go ahead, Andrew. One of you sent me an article that was posted on the Arctic News blog, and the title of it was "Accelerated Global Warming and Stadio Cooling Events: The IPCC Oversights Regarding Future Climate Trends." I would really like to delve into the fact that the IPCC is continuously behind the ball and are underestimating the rapidity of this extinction event. Could you give your thoughts on that, please?
Well, it's both underestimating, but it's also has been projecting linear development, linear warming trend. Now, the total warming might be similar to what the IPCC is indicating, but the linear trend is misleading, really, because we're not looking at smooth warming. We're looking at an increasingly unstable and stormy world, in the sense that the boundaries between climate zones are weakening, and the climate zones are moving, expanding, and migrating. And this triggers tipping points and extreme weather events. So what the IPCC is completely comprehensive and reliable when it comes to trying to document what is actually happening at the present time, and to a large extent what has transpired in the history of the atmosphere. However, when it comes to projections, to me, they are unreal. Why? Because they do not make much sense in terms of what we know about the evolution of the climate.
I'd like to back up a little bit, Dr. Glickson. Thank you, first of all, for joining us on the air again. And my first question is
good day, Guy. How are you?
My first question is actually two questions based on your latest book, The Event Horizon. What is the event horizon, and why should we be concerned?
Well, yes, the term climate change, again, is far from correct, in my view. We're not looking at a change. We're looking at a sharp, abrupt event. It's only 50, 60 years since the climate has accelerated in about 1970, 1975. Until then, it was serious, very serious warming, but nothing like the acceleration which we see since 1975, I'd say. Since then, it is an abrupt event. The composition of the atmosphere is changing at a rate that we don't see in much of the geological past. Well, there are such events, but caused by different factors, such as a major volcanic eruption or an asteroid impact. But we don't see anything like this within the last few million years. So I'm calling it an event, the event horizon, for this very reason.
And based on your past experience, which is considerable, especially with respect to mass extinction events, you've indicated that the one we're currently experiencing is occurring much faster than others. Can you talk a little bit about the potential consequences of this rapid rate of environmental change?
Sorry, the line is weak, and I have not heard your question precisely. But I guess you're asking me about the ice sheets, are you?
No, I'm asking about the potential consequences of this very rapid rate of environmental change that is ongoing with this current mass extinction event.
Yes, well, it's occurring within our lifetime. The consequences are all around us. You open the papers and every other day there are serious hurricanes. There are horrible fires. We just experienced last summer a fire which has destroyed a huge part of our native forests, mostly in eastern Australia. It's happening now. Not everywhere, not all of the time, but when you follow the news, it hits different regions. For example, the Caribbean, the Philippines, are regions which are coming under increasing stress. So the hurricanes, the fires, are the manifestation of this event horizon, this extreme event. And we are in the eye of the storm. People are aware of it, but people at the same time are not being told the full truth about the severity and the direction in which the world is going.
Andrew, there was an incredible event that took place in New Zealand as a result of the fires that were happening in Australia in the last fire season. The smoke and soot was so dense that it was carried across the Tasman Sea to New Zealand, and we could see it. You could literally see it in the atmosphere, and a whole lot of that soot landed on our glaciers and turned them pink, and sped up the melting on our glaciers in New Zealand. It's incredible that those fires could have that direct result on the other side of the Tasman Sea.
Yes, that's right, and it goes further than New Zealand. The smoke has gone into somewhere in the central South Pacific. It comes to show the effects of fires. I mean, the amount of carbon dioxide which was released from these fires is almost similar to what Australia emits otherwise every year. And then there are, of course, the fires in California. If there were isolated events, this would have been one thing. But this is very much a part of the trend. Much of the Earth is now subject to severe fires, including the Arctic. There are fires in Siberia, in Scandinavia, in Alaska, in Greenland. Now, the fires there are a result, as you probably know, from the weakening of the jet stream, which is a boundary between the Arctic and the northern latitudes. This boundary was pretty sharp and effective in limiting the extent of migration of cold air masses and warm air masses. I mean, there are tropical fronts coming from the south and there are Arctic fronts coming from the north. They were limited in the past, but now the weakening of the jet stream of the vortex, Arctic vortex, the polar vortex, allows this storm, this air masses to penetrate. And of course, you know about the beast from the east and so on.
Exactly what you said about the jet streams meandering and changing. That Saharan dust was carried across the Atlantic and dumped in the Arctic, and that lowered the albedo as well. It's sort of incomprehensible that it could be changing so radically in such a short amount of time before our very eyes.
Yes, before our very eyes. The albedo is decreasing, of course, as open water are exposed and the ice sheets are melting. Or about, I think, 1/3 of the Arctic Sea Arctic Sea ice has gone at this stage. And the warm fronts penetrate from the south. So this means that the migration or the opening of the boundaries of the climate zones is changing the climate pattern of the Earth in a fundamental way, again, before our eyes. The entire pattern means now that the boundaries which did exist are weakened and no longer are able to limit the clash between cold and warm masses of air. So you get storminess basically everywhere, whether it's on the margin of the poles, or whether it's in the tropics. So basically, wherever you look, you get increased storminess, which means cyclones, hurricanes, and the fires are a part of it.
And speaking of fires, the abstract of your latest book on the Springer website raises the question whether a criterion exists that fundamentally distinguishes humans from other species, and then goes on to suggest the use of fire as such a criterion. Thus, the title of the book, The Event Horizon, Homo Prometheus and the Climate Catastrophe. How does our use of fire distinguish us from the other great apes, and why is Prometheus central to your story?
Well, as you know, Prometheus is a Greek titan who has stolen the fire from the gods and given it to humankind. So he is responsible. He is a culprit, and it's a symbol for the way we are, what we are doing. We are Prometheans in the sense that we are the only species which has mastered fire. And, well, that's more than 1 million years ago, of course. And at this stage, fire has allowed us to develop an industry to dig and burn coal and oil and gas, and with the consequences which are upon us. The other thing I like to say is, basically what you're looking at is that the train has left the station. When you read about the rise of temperatures, which NASA and NOAA define as approximately 1 degree above pre-industrial, in fact, on the continent, it's already about 1.5 and more. And when you take into account the role of aerosols, which are still cooling the air, so on average by about, well, perhaps 0.5 a degree or so, although the aerosols are not uniformly distributed. If you take the aerosols into account, we are at 2 degrees, which means 2 degrees, that's almost 50% of what's considered to be the ultimate, according to Sheldon Huber, that's a German chief climate scientist, and others. 4 degrees, according to them, means civilization, which means civilization can hardly cope with 4 degrees. And we are already half the way there.
We're already halfway there. I'd like to get back to the Arctic sea ice issue again. As most of our listeners will know, there's been a catastrophically slow refreeze in the Arctic this year after reaching the sea ice minimum. And we've lost most of the old fast ice or the older ice. And on the bottom of that ice is algae and an entire ecosystem that is fundamental to the marine food web. My question is, how much of a danger do you think the loss of the sea ice is to the Arctic marine food web?
Yes, there is the albedo, of course, which you already mentioned. Now, the algae and the krill also, little crustaceans, they form the base of the food chain. And so, as they weaken and they die, then the whole food chain of the Arctic, and to some extent the oceans surrounding the Antarctic, is weakening. There is a lot of literature now about what's happening to the microflora and to the krill under the ice. In one sense, because the ice is thinning, there is more light coming through to enrich the flora, microflora, and the plankton. But this is relatively short term, because once the ice goes, there will be very little microflora and krill. The food chain of the Arctic and also the surrounding Antarctic, although Antarctic is a very different case.
It seems to be happening slower in Antarctica than it is in the Arctic, possibly because of the sheer mass of it. But what we're seeing in New Zealand now is we seem to be getting much more disrupted weather, getting cold spells in the middle of our, supposed to be warming up now. So I wonder now, is the same thing starting to happen to the southern hemisphere jet streams that you've written about previously in the northern hemisphere?
So you're saying that you're seeing more storminess on New Zealand? Is this what you were saying?
Well, no, I think not so much more storms as such, but what we're doing is we're getting more cold weather leaking out of the Antarctic than I would have expected at this time of year. So I think we're seeing a similar sort of disruption.
Well, in principle, that's true, although on a different, yes, in principle, that's, what you say is true, but it occurs on a different scale. In the north, there is what's called a beast from the east, which comes through Siberia and over to northern Europe, including England and so on. It's huge snowstorms also in North America. In the south, you will have leaks of, you get ice melt, which results in regions of cold water around the Weddell Sea, for example. And this cold front or masses, they leak to the north, although it has not reached the scale or magnitude as it has in the Arctic.
What do you think is going to happen to the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation? There is evidence that that is slowing down. What are your concerns when it comes to the AMOC?
Yes, it's weakening very significantly, and there are a lot of reports about it. There's a large pool of cold ice melt water south of Greenland, which was documented by the German Potsdam Institute. And there are other indications that the circulation of the North Atlantic current is weakening significantly.
It's weakening significantly. This is so fundamental to all the weather on the planet, and it's weakening significantly. It's a terrifying possibility that it could get even worse or even shut down.
And where do you think that would lead,
what happens,
Dr. Glickman?
Well, you see what happens in different regions is actually ultimately triggered by the migration of the climate zones. The tropics are expanding, the mid-latitudes are getting more rain and snow, and the polar regions are warming, although at different rates. So you can look, of course, at the isolated or individual or regional developments in terms of storminess, in terms of heating or cooling. But ultimately, when you're looking at the underlying factors, it's the shift or the migration of the climate zones, which is disrupting the old climate zones and boundaries and resulting in clash of cold and warm air fronts. I'm actually in the process of writing an article about it. But what I'm saying is in the sense of a review. It's not new. But I am essentially looking at what's happening now in terms of paleoclimate processes. And when you look at it this way, what's happening now is already got the magnitude of the last termination, the last glacial termination, which is between 21,000 and about 10,000 years ago, which was, well, it took at least 10,000 years or so. When you compare this, and this was 5 degrees, it was 5 degrees warming and about almost 100 meters sea level rise. What happens now is happening an order of magnitude to 2 orders of magnitude faster than the last glacial termination.
Well, that can't be good.
I'd like to now talk about the elephant in the room, as you described it in some of the literature that you've sent to me. The elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about, methane. What are your thoughts on methane? And I don't know if you're aware or not, but Dr. Peter Wadhams, one of the most experienced sea ice experts on the planet, has recently been attacked because of his talks about the threat of methane. Why is the stigma about us talking about methane?
Well, it is the elephant in the room. It's got a radiative force which is initially about 80 times more than carbon dioxide, Then it declines to about 25. But the atmospheric concentration of methane since the industrial age begun has risen from about 600 parts per billion to now it's just under 2,000, about 1,800 or so. This is a threefold increase in the higher latitudes. But now methane is also emitted from fracking, drilling, fracking of carbon syngas, which is occurring in the USA, in Australia, in other parts of the world. It's a very effective way of producing energy and a very effective way of raising the methane concentration of the atmosphere as well. So you're asking about methane. Yes, it's a time bomb. The methane, of course, oxidizes slowly, and so far it's mostly concentrated at higher latitudes in the north. But its effects are flowing over to the rest of the world. The rates are not known exactly, but it, of course, has been reported, as you know, by the Russians, except for, I suppose, political reasons. Some people in the West do not believe the Russian data, but when you look at Siberia, large part of it is heavily cratered by methane explosions. This tells a story in its own right.
You mentioned that methane is initially about 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and that it drops to about 25 times later. But as I understand it, that decline to about 25 times greater only occurs if methane decreases in the atmosphere. And it seems to me that once we get the methane increase in the atmosphere, it's not going to go down. It's not going to decline anytime soon. Can you comment on that? Have I got that backwards?
Well, it declines because it gets oxidized, and it depends on which level of the atmosphere you're looking at. Methane is relatively heavy gas, so it will tend to descend to levels where there is a lot of oxygen, so much of it does get oxidized. Now, the rate at which it turns into carbon dioxide is, I think, between 50 and 100 years. This will depend on local circumstances.
One of the things I note about our previous discussion about the IPCC is in the IPCC representative concentration pathways, they're not talking about any methane coming out of the Arctic until the end of the century. And you and I and Guy have seen an enormous amount of evidence to say it's being released at the moment. Some of these pingo holes are a kilometre across. That takes an extraordinary amount of pressure to blow that land away.
Well, yes, it has tripled, like I said before, from 600 to just under 2,000. And you get all the craters. You get so much evidence so that the objection is, not purely, I don't get the impression the objection is purely scientific. There are politics involved. There are a lot of people who don't want to alarm the public too much. And of course, there is the East and the West. There's a gap in trust between Western scientists and some of the Russian scientists. So I don't want to talk about the politics of it, but it is a pressure on the IPCC. The reports, the scientific papers on which the IPCC is based are essentially the best evidence we have. However, when it comes to future projections, they have neglected a number of developments which is hard to understand. The report hardly mentions stadials, and yet there are now important papers in the literature, peer review papers, for example, by Hansen and his group, which point out to the development of stadials, which is basically cooling of part of the ocean due to ice melt water. I cannot understand it. Something is not right here. The linear trends which the IPCC portrays, that's not right either. It's not consistent with anything we see even in the recent climate history of the Earth, the Quaternary. And then there are other. The rate of ice sheet breakdown has been underestimated by the IPCC. So I worry about what people say it could have been politically influenced.
Yeah, when I think about the IPCC, I think about this quaint old scientific tradition that's been thrown in the garbage can. It used to be the precautionary principle. I don't see anyone using the precautionary principle anymore.
Well, Hansen called it scientific reticence. Scientists, all of us, including me, are reluctant to convey or broadcast news which frighten and even shock other people. It's just human nature. I mean, who wants to be a Cassandra and go and propagate news which amount to the end of nature as we know it? We don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And yet, scientists owe it to communicate the evidence. There's no way out of it, or otherwise we become denialists. It's a terrible bind.
It is indeed, and it's why I'm always so grateful to have you to come on the show to talk about it, because you don't suffer from that reticence. Hey, another thing that you've spoken about regularly in your books is military conflict and the role that military conflict is playing in the whole dichotomy. You know, the Pentagon is one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels on the planet. Do you have continuing concerns that as habitat disappears at various places on the planet, that we'll be fighting over the last bits of habitat?
Well, yes, it's very well known that the military forces worldwide, and particularly in the United States, are responsible to major emissions of carbon around the world, from the Navy, the Air Force, and so on. The point about the military to me is the military worldwide is consuming several $1 trillion every year. This is precisely the resource which needs to be directed to, if possible, sequester or down draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The reason that down draw has become essential is that now that the level of carbon dioxide combined with methane, combined with nitrous oxide, has now reached approximately 500 parts per million. That's CO2 equivalent. This is generating amplifying feedbacks from land and ocean, which means no matter to what extent we reduce our emissions, which of course we have to do, the level of the radiation from the atmosphere at this level of carbon dioxide is generating amplifying feedbacks. And the only way, in principle and theory, is to draw down, sequester. For this, you need funds, you need budget of the size used by the military, trillions. And I wish I could see other ways of trying to arrest the warming of the atmosphere, cool the atmosphere. But apart from drawdown, which has been tried locally and to a limited extent, I cannot see what can be done.
Well, that's another reason why I have issues with the IPCC. In the representative concentration pathways, they have factored in carbon capture and storage technology that doesn't even exist at scale. That's how bad and how laissez-faire some of those decisions have been made by that organization, in my opinion.
Well, yes, the models lag far behind the reality, and some of them are not even correct. This linear trajectories, which you see in IPCC report, going to the end of this century, even to 2300 and further. These linear models and the calculations which suggest that they can be flattened and even reduced, where it's not even specified how it will happen. This is theory, but I myself tend to look at the evidence, both at present but also the paleoclimate evidence, and have some questions about these models.
Yeah, I've always had a huge respect for field researchers like yourself and Peter Wadhams, who have done a lot of their science out in the field. On that subject, I noticed that the BBC published an article a couple of days ago titled "Polar Scientists Wary of Impending Satellite Gap," as the two satellites dedicated to observing the poles are almost certain to die before replacements are flown. You know, we're about to lose some of our satellite research satellites. So I think that's going to be another issue where we'll be going back to the models, and the models aren't telling the truth, whereas these satellites can actually tell us what's happening on the ground.
Yes, that's right. Well, I don't know about the degree of research, but as we know, in the United States under Trump, some of the funds required for climate research have not grown or possibly even reduced. Well, following up what's happening almost week by week, month by month, it's not a very encouraging thing to do. The point is now, what can be done to arrest this rise in temperature? And I cannot see the political classes doing very much in this regard. Much of the time, it doesn't seem to me they are telling the whole story or even telling the truth.
I want to backtrack just a little bit. About 2 weeks ago, in your November 16th, 2020 article for the Arctic News blog, you indicate that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment downplays the importance of stadial cooling events. That paper is titled Accelerated Global Warming and Stadial Cooling Events, IPCC Oversights Regarding Future Climate Trends. Will you let our listeners know what a stadial cooling event is, and what comprises a stadial cooling event, and what are the potential consequences?
Yeah, well, essentially, it's the flow of ice melt water into the oceans, which you can see in, especially south of Greenland, especially in parts of the ocean fringing Antarctica, like the Weddell Sea. In the North Atlantic, the German Ramsford has reported a very large study south of Greenland. Now, this study have been well pronounced through the history of the glacial interglacial cycles. When you look at the graph of the temperature graphs of the glacial interglacial cycles, you will see that every time there was a peak warming occurred, and several times, at least 8 times recorded in the ice cores, it was followed by strong cooling. And the most pronounced one is the Younger Dryas. I'm sure you know about that. The Younger Dryas lasted about 1200 years, between 12,000 years ago and 11,700 or so years ago, and the temperature plunged. It's following a peak temperature before then. The temperature plunged by several degrees, and much of the northern hemisphere, particularly to some extent Antarctica also, have cooled abruptly. And it's called Younger Dryas because of a flower called Dryas flower, which appears under cool climates. The Younger Dryas it's a hallmark of what could happen. It's a huge event. There's quite a bit of literature about it. You read about it. You read about a major abrupt cooling event. The cooling occurred within, in some estimates actually by Stephenson and others, it occurred within a few years Why? Because of the amplifying effect. Just you get amplification when the ice melts, but you also get amplification when the water freezes. What we're looking at now is, and James Hansen already delineated stadials, although he delineated minor stadials, in about the middle of the century, 2050 or so. It's in his model, his 2016 paper with a large number of American paleoclimate scientists. The younger dryas is something which is, to me, it's over the horizon, although we can't say how big and we can't say when it will happen exactly. It's inevitable on the basis of two things. One, the paleoclimate record, which I just talked about, and the other one, what we're already starting to see.
Well, that sounds like good news to me. I read and hear about the temperature rising, and you're talking about the temperature plummeting. Now, the average listener would think this is good news. What's wrong with this story?
I'm sorry, I missed you. It's a weak line, and I'm having difficulty in identifying exactly what you and what Kevin are saying.
You indicate that the younger dryas will cool the planet, or at least in certain regions. And I constantly hear that the overheating of the planet is going to be problematic. If the younger dryas, or if a younger dryas type event cools the planet in the wake of what appears to be a warming climate, isn't that a good thing?
Well, whether it's good or bad, it's our human perspective, but this is why this linear projection by the IPCC are, to me, very suspect. That we're not looking at smooth linear warming. What we're looking at is a stormy, unstable, highly unstable climate. The time frame is not clear. The magnitude of these oscillations, of these disturbances, is not clear. But when you get warming to the extent that we are looking at now, we're already at, up to 2 degrees on the continents, then a lot of ice melts. There are only a limited volume of ice in Greenland, which would, when it melts, it raises sea levels by 6 or 7 meters. But there is a huge amount of ice in Antarctic, and it's already melting in some parts in West Antarctic. Once it melts, there will be major effects on the southern oceans. And there is a very important paper about the cooling of the southern oceans. I'm trying to remember the name of the author, but I will send it to you anyway.
Also in that Arctic News blog paper from November 16th of this year, you describe the weakening of the jet stream and the migration of climate zones as indications of Earth's energy imbalance. You've already talked a little bit about the migration of climate zones in some detail. What about that weakening of the jet stream? Can you explain to our listeners how that might play out and what the likely consequences are?
Yes, it's very much at the center of it. The weakening occurs because the Arctic warms faster than any other latitude. The Arctic has warmed on average, I think, by 2.2 degrees, but locally, regionally, there are reports now, and I've just been reading one of them, that it's been warming above 4 degrees and in some cases close to 10 degrees Celsius. So, let me see, you were asking me, sorry, I lost the thread of our conversation. You were asking me again?
What are the implications of a weakening of the jet stream? Where does that take us?
Yes, indeed. So, since it weakens, since the Arctic warms 2 or more times faster than the northern latitudes, or rather the mid-northern latitudes, the temperature contrast between across the jet stream, which is a boundary actually, the temperature contrast is lesser and lesser. as the boundary weakens, the fronts can cross, masses of air can cross across the boundary. Now, these are the cold masses of air which penetrate into Europe, Northern Europe, the UK, and otherwise Russia and Siberia, and North America, of course. They penetrate and they result in this beast from the east type of snowstorms. On the other hand, there are tropical air masses which can also penetrate from the south, and that's why you get the heat waves and the fires in Alaska, in Greenland, in Siberia. So this is now published in a number of papers. I've written about it. I can certainly send you my more recent papers in this regard. But the boundaries weaken. It's not the only boundary, not the only jet stream boundary which weakens. Other boundaries weaken too, as the areas which originally had extreme climate zones, tropical and Arctic, now it starts to become more uniform, homogenized. When it becomes more uniform, it means that cold and hot, cold and tropical air masses collide with each other to a greater extent than they have before.
The description of your latest book, which again is The Event Horizon, Homo Prometheus and the Climate Catastrophe. The description begins with this statement, quote, "With the advent of global warming and the nuclear arms race, humans are rapidly approaching a moment of truth." Later in the description you write, "Existentialist philosophy offers a way of coping with the unthinkable." What is the moment of truth, and how can existentialist philosophy help prepare us, poor mortal humans, in light of this moment of truth?
Yes, I'm glad that you've raised this point, because it's something which, everyone, I'd say, who is aware of the evidence has to grapple with. The moment of truth is really our generations. We are the first generation and that's something which actually Barack Obama said. We are the first generation which is facing a serious climate change, and we are the last one which can do anything about it. As to existential theory, well, this can become personal. Existentialism, as you know, it allows you to accept the evidence, accept life as it is. And it emphasizes the moment. In Sartre and Camus' existentialism, the hero, Sisyphus, toils all his life pushing a rock up to the top of the mountain. And the only time that he has any reward and insight is when he turns around after having pushed the rock and looks over the horizon. Well, living for the moment, that's basically it. And in fact, in a way, life has always been for the moment. Now it's what's happening to the planet. In previous years, my parents and grandparent generations, they were trying to survive through world wars, World War I, World War II, which also looked like the end. So the philosophy, existentialist philosophy, is one way to try and cope with what's happening. Of course, religion is the other one. And I envy religious people. They can look at the world and they can say, well, God has given and God has taken, may God be blessed. But I happen not to be religious, so to me existential philosophy is important.
Would you consider yourself a Stoic?
A what, Stoic?
Would you consider yourself
Did you
a
say Stoic?
Because your personal philosophy sounds a lot like Stoicism to me. Would you consider yourself a Stoic?
Well, I don't live a Stoic way of life. I'm trapped in a modern world, in the suburb. We are drive vehicles, we use the electronic medium, we are saved by medical science. I'm not a stoic in terms of my way of life, but in terms of the way I feel and think, I love nature. I've been a geologist much of my life. I love the animals. I love the birds. I feel and I think there's a lot of evidence that particularly the birds are extremely intelligent creatures, both individually and in combination in flocks. So I have a deep admiration towards nature, and I grieve when I think that what we're doing to the climate and to the earth is going to take them down with us.
That's great. I think Kevin has a question now about poetry of all things, and maybe that ties into what we've been talking about in the last few minutes. Kevin?
Yes, it absolutely does. One of the things that I learned from Andrew the last time that we interviewed you was that you write poetry, and I've got one of your poetry books. And I think that it's important for a lot of us who are studying closely what's happening around us and grieving, as you use the word grief, and I'm glad that you did, because so few people admit it. We're all grieving. Anyone who is engaged with the natural world and seeing what's happening is grieving. My antidote to despair is to volunteer at a nursery that we have on our island, a native tree nursery, and I'm involved in a rewilding project. And I know that the outcome of that project isn't going to be great in the long run, but it's still something for me to do in the short term to maintain my sanity. Are you still writing poetry?
Much of my poetry I have written some 25 years ago, which was self-published in books. And I'm glad you have one of these books, and I can certainly send you whatever later poetry I've written. But nowadays, I haven't been writing that much, but it does reflect my spirit, I suppose. So it's anyone who likes to know how I feel, rather than ask me, best look at the poems I've written. But then time has changed. I've written most of these poems before the climate has really started closing in on us, although I was very concerned, I still am very concerned about the nuclear issue.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here. I'd like to give a big thank you to Professor Andrew Glickson for joining us on today's show.
Yes, well, it's a pleasure talking to you too. You're some of the people who are both aware and deeply care about what's happening to the earth. Not everybody does. I'm dismayed when I see and meet people who have not taken this issue to heart. But then they live for the moment, and I suppose we're all trying to do that in our different ways.
Yeah, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance about the whole issue where people just can't confront it. Hey, Andrew, I'm going to have to wrap the show now. Thank you so much for your time again. I really appreciate it. And I also have to thank Afrozen for our theme music. You can catch NBL on PRN the first Tuesday afternoon of the month at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Our next episode is scheduled to air live on January the 5th, 2021. If you missed the broadcast, you can find shows in the archives at prn.fm, the Podbeam at Stitcher, and feel free to rate us on iTunes. Go well, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I really appreciate talking with you both.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us again.
Mother Nature, she's gonna get you. Yeah, she's gonna get you. Mother Nature, she's grown to hate you, and she's gonna get you. Gonna get you, you betcha.